Lie back, put your headphones in, snuggle in tight. Are you all ready? Then let me read you a bedtime story, my dears. Let's begin. Well, my darlings, it has been an interesting week, and I have done a lot of collabs for other people. So at this point, I was looking for something for your sleeping pleasure, and I thought I would share some real American ghost stories from the Victorian era, from actual newspaper articles. I do hope you enjoy. The Giant Ghost, Philadelphia Press, September 13, 1896. A case in point is the Benton, Indiana ghost, which is attracting much attention. It has been seen and investigated by many people with reputations for intelligence and good sense. But so far, no explanation of the strange appearance has been found. A farmer named John W. French and his wife were the first to see this apparition. They live in the country near Benton and were driving home one night from a neighbor's. The road passed an old church, moss-covered and surrounded by a graveyard, overgrown with shrubbery and filled with the bones of hundreds who once tilled the soil in the locality. 10 years ago, an aged man who lived alone not far from the old church and visited the graveyard almost daily to pray over the resting place of some relative, was found foully murdered for the store of gold he was supposed to have hidden about his hermit abode. The robbers and murderers escaped justice, and the luckless graybeard was buried in the graveyard where he spent so much time. Just as French and his wife drew within sight of the white headstones in the churchyard, the horses reared back on their haunches and snorted in terror. French was alarmed, and suspecting highwaymen had been scented by the horses, he reached for a shotgun which lay in the bottom of the wagon, just for such an emergency. But before his hand touched it, he was startled by a scream from his wife. Clutching his arm, she pointed straight ahead and gasped, "Look, John, look!" Far down the road, just beside the glimmering monuments of the old graveyard, he saw an apparition. It was that of a man with a long white beard sweeping over his breast. The figure appeared to be 8 feet in height, and in one hand it carried a club, such as the brains of the old man had been beaten out with 10 years before. Slowly raising one arm, the ghost, with a majestic sweep, beckoned French to come ahead. He was too startled to do anything except try to restrain the prancing horses, which were straining at the harness in attempts to break away and run. A cold sweat started out all over the body of the farmer, and he realized, at last, he was looking at a ghost. And then the sound of his wife's voice came to him, begging him to return the way they had come and escape the doom which seemed impending. French was still too much scared and excited to control the horses, and as he gazed steadfastly at the fearful white object in the road, it slowly began to move forward towards the wagon. The club was now raised to its shoulder as a soldier carries a rifle, and it seemed to move forward without touching the ground, like a winged thing. Then the farmer recovered his faculties and, whirling his team about, he lashed the horses into a run and began to trip to the house of the friend he had just left. When they arrived there, both the man and his wife were almost fainting from fright. The next man to see the ghost was Milton Moon. He had the reputation for being not only a man of intelligence, but one without fear. His experience was much the same as that of the French's, and it brought about several investigations by parties of citizens. In each case they saw and were convinced of the actual presence of the ghost, without being able to discover any satisfactory explanation. Some famous ghosts of the National Capital. Philadelphia Press, October 2nd, 1898. The Capitol at Washington is probably the most thoroughly haunted building in the world. Not less than 15 well-authenticated ghosts infest it, and some of them are of a more than ordinary alarming character. What particularly inspires this last remark is the fact that the demon cat is said to have made its appearance again after many years of absence. This is a truly horrific apparition, and no viewless specter, such as the invisible grimalkin, that even now trips people on the stairs of the old mansion which President Madison and his wife Dolly occupied at the corner of 18th Street and New York Avenue. After the White House was burned by the British, that indeed is altogether another story. But the feline spook of the Capitol possesses attributes much more remarkable, inasmuch as it has the appearance of an ordinary kitty when first seen, and presently swells up to the size of an elephant before the eyes of the terrified observer. The demon cat, in whose regard testimony of the utmost authenticity was put on record 35 years ago, has been missing since 1862. One of the watchmen on duty in the building shot at it then, and it disappeared. Since then until now, nothing more has been heard of it, though one or two of the older policemen of the Capitol Force still speak of the spectral animal in odd whispers. Their work, when performed in the night, requires more than ordinary nerve, inasmuch as the interior of the great structure is literally alive with echoes and other suggestions of the supernatural. In the daytime, when the place is full of people and the noises of busy life, the professional guides make a point of showing persons how a whisper uttered when standing on a certain marble block is distinctly audible at another point quite a distance away, though unheard in the space between. A good many phenomena of this kind are observable in various parts of the Capitol, and the extent to which they become augmented in strangeness during the silence of the night may well be conceived. The silence of any ordinary house is oppressive sometimes to the least superstitious individual. There are unaccountable noises, and a weird and eerie sort of feeling comes over him, distracting him perhaps from the perusal of his book. He finds himself indulging in a vague sense of alarm, though he cannot imagine any cause for it. Such suggestions of the supernatural are magnified 1,000-fold in the Capitol when the watchman pursues his lone beat through the great corridors, whose immense spaces impress him with a sense of solitariness, while the shadows thrown by his lantern gather into strange and menacing forms. One of the most curious and alarming of the audible phenomenon observable in the Capitol, so all the watchmen say, is a ghostly footstep that seems to follow anybody who crosses Statuary Hall at night. It was in this hall, then the chamber of the House of the Representatives, that John Quincy Adams died, at a spot indicated now by a brass tablet set in a stone slab where stood his desk. Whether or not it is his ghost that pursues is a question open to dispute, though it is to be hoped that the venerable ex-president rests more quietly in his grave. At all events, the performance is unpleasant, and even gruesome for him who walks across that historic floor, while the white marble statues of dead statesmen placed around the walls seem to point at him with outstretched arms derisively. Like the man in Coleridge's famous line, he walks in fear and dread, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. At all events, he is uncertain lest such may be the case, and of course the duties of the watchman oblige him, when so assigned, to patrol the basement of the building, where all sorts of hobgoblins lie in wait. One of the Capitol policemen was almost frightened out of his wits one night when a pair of flaming eyes looked out at him from the vaults under the chamber of the House of Representatives, where the wood is stored for the fire. One of the Capitol policemen was almost frightened out of his wits one night when a pair of flaming eyes looked out at him from the vaults under the chamber of the House of Representatives, where the wood is stored for the fires. It was subsequently ascertained that the eyes in question were those of a fox, which, being chivied through the town, had sought refuge in the cellar of the edifice occupied by the national legislature. The animal was killed for the reason which obliges a white man to slay any innocent beast that comes under his power. Well, that's a statement, isn't it? But speaking of the steps which follow a person at night across the floor of Statuary Hall, a bold watchman attempted not long ago to investigate them on scientific principle. He suspected a trick and so brought a pair of rubber shoes, with the aid of which he proceeded to examine into the question. In the stillness of the night, he made a business of patrolling that portion of the principal government edifice, and, sure enough, the footsteps followed along behind him. He cornered them. It was surely some trickster. There was no possibility for the joker to get away. But a moment later the steps were heard in another part of the hall. They had evaded him successfully. Similar experiments were tried on other nights, but they all ended in the same way. 4 years ago there died in Washington an old gentleman who had been employed for 35 years in the Library of Congress. The quarters of that great book collection, while housed in the Capitol, were distressingly restricted, and much of the cataloging was done by the veteran mentioned in a sort of vault in the subcellar. This vault was crammed with musty tomes from floor to ceiling, and practically no air was admitted. It was a wonder that he lived so long, but when he came to die, he did it rather suddenly. Anyhow, he became paralyzed and unable to speak, though up to the time of his actual demise, he was able to indicate his wants by gestures. Among other things, he showed plainly by signs that he wished to be conveyed to the old library. This wish of his was not obeyed, for reasons which seemed sufficient to his family, and finally he relinquished it by giving up the ghost. It was afterwards learned that he had hidden, almost undoubtedly, $6,000 worth of registered U.S. bonds among the books in his subcellar den, presumably concealed between the leaves of some of the moth-eaten volumes of which he was the appointed guardian. Certainly there could be no better or less suspect hiding place, but this was just where the trouble came in for the heirs, in whose interests the books were vainly searched and shaken. When the transfer of the library from the old to its new quarters were accomplished, the heirs cannot secure a renewal of the bonds by the government without furnishing proof of the loss of the originals, which is lacking, and meanwhile it is said that the ghost of the old gentleman haunts the vaults in the sub-basement, which he used to inhabit, looking vainly for the missing securities. The old gentleman referred to had some curious traits, though he was by no means a miser, such as keeping of every burnt match that he came across. He would put them away in the drawer of his private desk, together with expired streetcar transfers, the later done up in neat bundles with India rubber bands. Quite an intimate friend he had, named Twine, who lost his grip on the perch, so to speak, about 6 years back. Mr. Twine dwelt during the working hours of the day in a sort of cage of iron, like that of Dreyfus, in the basement of the Capitol. As a matter of fact, Dreyfus does not occupy a cage at all. The notion that he does so arises from the misunderstanding of the French word case, which signifies a hut. However, Twine's cage was a real one of iron wire, and inside of it he made a business of stamping the books of the library with a mixture made of alcohol and lampblack. If the observation of casual employees about the Capitol is to be trusted, Mr. Twine's ghost is still engaged at intervals in the business of stamping books at the old stand, though his industry must be very unprofitable, since the government's literary collection has been moved out of the Capitol. Ghosts are supposed to appertain most appropriately to the lower regions, inasmuch as the ancients who described them first consigned the blessed as well as the damned to a nether world. Consequently, it is not surprising to find that the phantoms of the Capitol are mostly relegated to the basement. Exceptions are made in the case of Vice President Wilson, who will be remembered, died in his room at the Senate at the end of the building, and also with respect to John Quincy Adams, whose nocturnal perambulations are so annoying to the Watchmen. Mr. Wilson is only an occasional visitor on the premises. It is understood, finding his way thither, probably when nothing else of importance is up, so to speak, in the spiritual realm which now claims him for its own. It's related that on one occasion he nearly frightened to death a watchman who was guarding the coffin of a Tennessee senator who was lying in state in the state chamber. The startle was doubtless uncontemplated, inasmuch as the senator was too well bred a man to take anybody unpleasant by surprise. There was a watchman employed quite a while ago as a member of the Capitol Police who was discharged finally for drunkenness. No faith, therefore, it is to be placed in his sworn statement, which was actually made to the effect that on a certain occasion he passed through the old Hall of Representatives, now Statuary Hall, and saw in session the Congress of 1848, with John Quincy Adams and many other men whose names have long ago passed into history. It was, if the word of the witness is to be believed, a phantom legislative crew, resembling in kind, if not in character, the goblins which Rip Van Winkle encountered on his trip to the summits of the storied Catskills. But to come down to things that are well authenticated and sure, comparatively speaking, the basement of the Capitol, as has been said, is part of the building chiefly haunted. Beneath the hall of the House of Representatives strolls by night a melancholy specter, with erect figure, a great mustache, and his hands clasped behind him. Who he is nobody has ever surmised. He might be, judging from his aspect, a foreigner in the diplomatic service, but that is merely a guess. Watchmen at night have approached him in the belief that he was an intruder, but he is faded from sight instantly, like a picture on a magic lantern slide. At precisely 12:30 of the clock every night, so it is said, the door of the room occupied by the Committee on Military and Militia of the Senate opens silently, and there steps forth the figure of General Logan, recognizable by his long black hair, military carriage, and the hat he was accustomed to wear in life. Logan was the chairman of this committee, and, if report be credited, he is still supervising its duties. A Genuine Ghost, Philadelphia Press, March 25th, 1884. Dayton, Ohio, March 25th. 1,000 people surrounded the graveyard in Miamisburg, a town near here, every night to witness the antics of what appears to be a genuine ghost. There is no doubt about the existence of the apparition, as Mayor Marshall, the revenue collector, and hundreds of prominent citizens all testify to having seen it. Last night, several hundred people armed with clubs and guns assaulted the specter, which appeared to be a woman in white. Clubs, bullets, and shot tore through the air in which the mystic figure floated without disconcerting it in the least. A portion of the town turned out en masse today and began exhuming all the bodies in the cemetery. The remains of the Bus family, composed of 3 people, have already been exhumed. The town is visited daily by hundreds of strangers, and none are disappointed, as the apparition is always on duty promptly at 9 o'clock. The strange figure was at once recognized by the inhabitants of the town as a young lady supposed to have been murdered several years ago. Her attitude while drifting among the graves is one of deep thought, with the head inclined forward and hands clasped behind. The baggage man's ghost. The corpse of the passengers killed in the disaster up at Spuyten Duyvil was fetched down here and laid out in the room. Was darkened, and I could just make out that storage room, said the Grand Central Depot baggageman. That's what gives it the name of morgue. Some of the boys got scared of going in after that, especially in the dark, and a lot of stories were started about spooks. We had a helper, a drunken chap that didn't know whether he saw a thing or dreamt it, and he swore to the toughest of the yarns. He said he went in to get a trunk. It was a whopper, and he braced himself for a big strain, but when he gripped it, it come up just as if there wasn't nothing in it more than air or gas. That unexpected kind of lift is like kicking at nothing. It's hurtful, don't you know? I should think so. Well, Joe felt as light-headed as the trunk, he says, but he brought it out. When he was putting it down, he was stunned to see a ghost sitting straddle of it. What did the ghost look like? Joe was so scared that he can't tell, except that it had grave clothes on, and it went out of sight as soon as he got out into the daylight, floated off, and at the same instant the trunk became as heavy as such a trunk generally is. Some of us believe Joe's story, and some don't, and he's one of them that does. He throwed up his job rather than go under the morgue again. Drummers see a specter. St. Louis Globe, Democrat, October 6th, 1887. The last man in the world to be accused of a belief in the supernatural would be your go-ahead, hard-headed American drummer or traveling man. Yet here's a plain tale of how not one but two of the Western fraternity saw a genuine ghost in broad daylight a few years ago. Jackson, Missouri, October 6th. At the place of the Turnpike Road between Cape Girardeau and Jackson is what is familiarly known as Spook's Hollow. The place is situated 4 miles from the Cape and is awfully dismal looking, where the road curves gracefully around a high bluff. 2 drummers representing a single leading wholesale house of St. Louis were recently making the drive from Jackson to the Cape when their attention was suddenly attracted at the Spook's Hollow by a white and airy object which arose in a peculiar form so as to be plainly visible and then maneuver in every imaginable manner, finally taking a zigzag journey through the low, dismal-looking surroundings, disappearing suddenly into the region from whence it came. More than one incident of dreadful experience has been related of this gloomy abode, and the place is looked upon by midnight tourists and the lonesome citizens of its nocturnal travels as an unpleasant spot, isolated from the beautiful country which surrounds it. Dr. Funk sees the spirit of Beecher. New York Herald, April 4th, 1903. While he will not admit that he is a believer in spiritualism, the Reverend Dr. Isaac Funk, head of the publishing house of Funk and Wagnalls, is so impressed with manifestations he has received from the spirit of Henry Ward Beecher that he has laid the entire matter before the Boston Society for Psychical Research and is anxiously awaiting a solution or explanation of what appears to him, after 25 years' study of the subject, the most remarkable test of the merit of the claims of spiritualists that has ever come within his observation. Although he has resorted to every means within his power to discover any fraud that may have been practiced upon him, he has been unable to explain away not only messages to him from the great minister, but the actual appearance to him of Mr. Beecher in the flesh. Dr. Funk and Mr. Beecher were intimate friends, and it would be difficult to practice deception as to Mr. Beecher's appearance. When the apparition appeared to Dr. Funk at a séance a short time ago, Dr. Funk was less than 3 feet distant from it, and had plenty of opportunity to detect a fraud, if it was being perpetrated, he believes. Every feature stood out distinctly, Dr. Funk said yesterday, in describing his experience, even to the hair and eyes, the color of the skin, and the expression of the mouth. Lines of the body, but it was still light enough to make the face plainly visible. I had a short conversation with the embodied spirit, and then it appeared to sink to the floor and fade away. Dr. Funk was especially anxious to have an opportunity to see and talk with Mr. Beecher in the hope that the light would be thrown on the mystery which surrounded the previous manifestation through the spirit of one Jack Rakestraw, who says he used to lead the choir in one of Mr. Beecher's churches, but frankly admits that he cannot remember exactly where the church was located. Even spirits have a way of forgetting things, spiritualists declare. Dr. Funk was informed that Mr. Beecher was troubled because the publisher had failed to return a coin known as the widow's mite, which he had borrowed some years ago from the late Professor Charles E. West, a well-known numismatist, to make a cut to illustrate a dictionary. Dr. Funk supposed the coin had been returned a long time ago, but upon looking the matter up, found it is in a drawer of a safe among some old papers, exactly as Mr. Rakestraw maintained. When Mr. Beecher appeared to him in person, so far as he could determine, Dr. Funk asked him several direct questions, to which the replies, he admits, were somewhat sublime. Although Dr. Funk has found the long-lost coin, which, by the way, is said to be worth $2,500, he is not certain to whom it should be returned, now that Professor West is dead and his collection of coins sold. Should the widow's mite go to Professor West's heirs, or the purchaser of the collection, is a question which has as yet remained unanswered. That is a matter I'm leaving to be determined by the Society for Psychical Research and Mrs. Piper, who ought to be able to learn from the spirit world what disposition Professor West wishes to have made of that coin, said Dr. Funk. It is, at any rate, a matter that does not appear to concern the spirit of Mr. Beecher. When what seemed to be Mr. Beecher's embodied spirit appeared to me, Dr. Funk said, I asked that very question. He smiled and replied that it was not a matter that concerned him especially, and that the whole thing was in the nature of a test, to prove to me that there actually are spirits, and that it is possible to have communication with them when all the conditions are favorable. He remarked that he was glad the old coin had been found, but seemed to consider the disposition of the matter of minor importance. He told me he was glad I was taking an interest in the subject, as he believed it would result in good for the world, and then excusing himself on the grounds that he had an engagement which it was necessary for him to keep, the apparition disappeared. Dr. Funk borrowed the coin from Professor West's collection, as a lighter-colored one he had already had was of doubtful authenticities. Both coins were sent to the governor expert in Philadelphia, and the lighter one was declared to be the genuine one. By the spirits it is now declared, however, that a mistake was made, and that the darker one, belonging to Professor West, has the greater value. I found both the light and the dark one in the drawer, said Dr. Funk, and remember distinctly that it was the darker of the two which I had borrowed from Professor West. I went to the next séance, and when Rakestraw's spirit arrived, I asked him to find out which one was to be returned. After a brief interval, his voice came to me. "Return the darker one, of course," he said. "That is the genuine coin, and is the one you borrowed from Dr. Beecher's friend." While I do not wish to be classified as a believer in spiritualism, I am certainly open to conviction after what has come under my personal observation, Dr. Funk concluded. I am confident that no fraud was practiced on me at the séance at which I was told about the old coin. The medium is an elderly woman living in Brooklyn who never appears in public, and the only person present were members of her family and known to me. But none of them knew any more about the coin being in my safe than I did. So quoth this raven. I hope you are all holding up well under this crazy situation. Stay safe, my darlings, and always come to visit me in my chateau. It's always open. That you can always go to. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and, of course, to Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams. Good night.